I now look to Brandon Davis to close the case for the proposition.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, and to the union. I have to tell you, I'm honored and humbled by the opportunity to stand in the footsteps of some of my heroes who have spoken to critical issues from this dais and look to, in this moment, speak to what I think is a critical issue from the dais. There have been gauntlets thrown down of the proposition side not speaking directly to the opposition. And I think of the arguments that I have heard and the arguments that concern me, what is most intriguing to me is the way that the opposition has taken an issue or a term that we all agree has no agreed upon definition and made it absolute. As the previous speaker said, if you wake up every day and you stub your toe on the dresser, don't stub your toe on the dresser tomorrow. We act as though, or at least the opposition acts as though, the populism is fait accompli. How it is driven, how it is utilized is fait accompli. It is not. It is neither a political ideology nor a political party specifically. What it is an approach to politics. And it has recently been a very winning approach to politics. And it has historically been a winning approach to politics. And so I look to make the argument here this evening, as this room begins to deliberate about how it will vote, that not only is populism a viable option for political engagement, it is valuable to the left to reclaim populism as an approach to driving its agenda. And I plan to lay that out to you both through the nature of practical realities. I believe in winning, as anyone who wants to move their agenda should. And it is true that we can win and not have winning be, and we can win through populism and not have winning be to the exclusion of our values. Two, it's an environment that we're operating in. We are foolish to think that somehow we control whether or not populist sentiments will bubble up from the electorate. But to my third point, how that populism is utilized is up to us. And I far more trust the left to utilize this political maneuver than I do the right, who has shown us time and time again that when they are trusted with it, they do not simply pit the people, lacking definition, against the elites. Instead, they pick a third party to play the politics of the people against. And oftentimes, particularly in the United States, the right has used this effectively to obscure the elites, to rob the people of their righteous indignation directed at sometimes institutions, sometimes actors, and sometimes that indignation is righteous and warranted. There have been comments made tonight that lead you to believe that we should never be in a political discourse that is aggressive or that utilizes a politic to point to an enemy. I don't agree with that. I think that there are enemies. There are certainly enemies to the agenda that I believe in, and I believe they should be called out. And I don't believe that it is toxic inherently in our politics when we call those folks out. So let me begin after laying out an overview of where I hope to go with just a few thoughts on where I think we are right now. One is that we are in an environment where our politics is largely toxic, but also stagnant. And I hear speakers here this evening speak to the idea, as I said before, that populism inherently is evil. Clearly, this room has a nasty taste in its mouth from the recent Brexit elections, as do we in the United States from the election of Donald Trump. It is an incredibly sour taste in our mouths. However, we don't think that the answer to winning is a shift in political maneuvering. We think the answer to winning is calling out what is true about our opponent. So if we live in that environment, I put forward that the idea of populism should not be thought of in any sort of static nature. It should instead be thought of as fluid on a spectrum of left to right and even centrist populism. Populism is not an ideology, it's a maneuver, as I said. And as Werner said, it is a permanent shadow in representative democracies. it is always there. The question of whether or not it is utilized and whether or not it pops up as a factor in the elections is at question. But it is a permanent shadow that hangs over the notion of representative democracies. And so I speak to populism as a fluid issue that sits on a spectrum. I also speak to it as someone who watched effectively as Barack Obama used populism, not as the way that it's been described here tonight, but to effectively point out, especially in 2012, that his opponent was an elite, that his opponent had been guilty of robbing workers of their jobs, even asking them to train their replacements before being told that they would be their replacements. I would say that that is a person that warrants, particularly from those folks and probably from a representative sample of who they look like, a certain amount of disdain. And I think that that is righteous. But Barack Obama used that without creating an other. And so I would quibble with the notion that the left cannot use populism in a distinct manner to the way that the right does. We have seen that the right thinks of this tool as a weapon that it can use to both obscure, to other, but also to be successful, which brings me to the beginning of 3 points that I want to make about why the left needs to reclaim populism. One, we are in an environment where populism thrives. We are in an environment of economic challenge. We are in an environment of massive shifts. Some might even say realignment across the globe. And in that environment, and particularly an environment where the notion of immigration and the debate of immigration and the othering that comes along with it is prevalent, that is an environment where populism thrives. And in an environment where populism thrives, it is foolish for a political party or a political ideology whose goal is to move its agenda for ideological or values-based reasons to shun a maneuver. And so I think from a practical standpoint, as a second part of this argument, the left has to reclaim populism because it is a means to driving an agenda. We find ourselves now in a position where it was said earlier that there's no reason why a factory worker from Michigan should be voting Republican. I agree with that sentiment, but we have allowed on the left for there to be an obscuring of who is actually the challenge to the expression of the life that that worker wants to have. We've allowed that to be obscured by a set of social issues, by a set of untruths, particularly about immigrants and the workforce. And we have done that to our own detriment. And so I would argue that the practicality says to us that if the goal is to drive an agenda and the goal is to win an agenda, then it is essential that we be able to engage what we think of as the will of the people and define what we believe to be the will of the people. The toxicity in populism often is not in the leadership, or in the people rather, it is in the leadership. And so as the leadership chooses to use this maneuver, we often find the toxicity either rising or falling within the electorate. So one, we are in an environment where populism will thrive, and in an environment where populism will thrive, it is foolish to consider that one should shun it. Two, there is a practical reality involved in that in an environment where populism will thrive, the ability of the left to capture that imagination and speak to where voters are and move them there is our ability to win and drive that agenda. And thirdly, the point that I would make is that we often overlook in the idea that populism is some static attitude or some static approach to politics, and in the disdain that we have for how we've seen populism recently expressed, I think that we are overlooking the potential for populism to be a unifying force. We right now deal with politics that are driven by many different things, sometimes gender, sometimes race, often economics. But what we often find is that while that is how our political debate should move, the way that it really moves, especially in the United States, is in a economic politic, multiple groups of economically centered people, but driven by race, as opposed to a multiracial politic driven by economics. And were the left to create that, which I believe is possible because I don't attribute populism as a static reality, but were the left to do that, then that is a recipe for a political engagement that has the ability to engage voters of color, young voters, and this elusive white working class that is talked about quite a great deal on the left in the United States, and quite frankly is creating havoc in many places across the globe, including here in Europe. So my point in this is that, one, we're in an environment where this will be real, and we have to react to that environment. It's practical to win. But thirdly, and I don't want to lose this point, there is an environment and there is an approach to populism that is unifying, that is almost necessary in a representative democracy, and that can be used in an environment where we have been divided by social issues and by race to create a multi-ethnic, economically driven politic that moves the left into a position of power that ultimately gets to what matters most, I believe, the ability in office to move an agenda. And so my closing point would be this, because were I the opposition, one question I would ask is, do you still believe this even if those shifts that you just described in populism don't occur? And my answer is yes, because the environmental and practical realities necessitate that any responsible political entity or political actor be thoughtful about how to use a maneuver as potent as the notion of what the people want to both unify, define, and drive a political agenda. So as you make choices about how to vote with your feet this evening, I hope that you will share my opinion both on the practicality as well as the legitimacy and therefore the necessity for the left to reclaim populism. Thank you.